We'll have a live security briefing from defense expert Yaakov Katz and hear analysis from the former commander of British Armed Forces in Afghanistan, Colonel Richard Kemp. From the Stand With Us studios in Jerusalem, I'm Michael Dixon, and this is Special Briefing. Shalom from Israel. Over 40,000 of you watched last week's show, and we're streaming on Stand With Us YouTube, Facebook, and X, and as a podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And it's a packed show for you today. We'll break down the security situation with former editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, Yaakov Katz, and then hear from defense expert and retired British Army officer Richard Kemp. But first, this was the scene when Israel's Yuval Raphael, our guest on last week's show, performed at the Eurovision Song Contest in Basel, Switzerland.
New day will rise. Everyone cries. Don't cry alone. Darkness will fade. All the pain will go by. But we will stay. Even if you say goodbye, a new day will rise. New day will rise. Thank you, Europe!
What a performance! Now, in the run-up to the competition, Yuval faced demonstrations, threats, and boos, and media told us that Israel's entry was controversial and contentious, despite being in Eurovision since 1973 and winning 4 times. And yet, by the time the contest was finished, Israel had almost won, finishing a close second. Spanish TV put up a defamatory slide before the show was broadcast, but the Spanish public gave maximum points to Israel. Irish TV tried to intercede with the contest organizers to ban Israel, but the Irish singer crashed out in the semi-final when Israel went through. Oh, and the Irish public gave Israel its second highest vote. In the end, the elite juries gave Israel a mixed result, but when it came to the public vote, Israel won. Let's say that again. The public voted overwhelmingly for Israel. And that tells us something important. The media and social media echo chamber is not representative of what people think about Israel. The silent majority, who stand for good, rewarded and embraced the bravest person on the Eurovision stage, a 24-year-old who at the Nova Festival on October 7, 2023, was forced to hide among dead bodies in a dumpster to escape terrorists. A survivor who, like Israel, rose resilient and triumphant. Congratulations to Yuval Raphael, the people's champion. Am Yisrael Chai, indeed. Our security briefing in just a moment, but first the news headlines from the last week of Israel at war. As terror group Hamas continues to refuse the release of 58 hostages it still holds in Gaza despite numerous ceasefire and hostage release offers, tensions remain high. In response, the IDF has mobilized thousands of reservists and expanded military operations aimed at neutralizing the threat posed by Hamas and pressuring the hostage release. The US president has concluded a diplomatic tour of the Gulf region during which he met with several regional leaders. Discussions focused on, among other topics, economic and arms agreements, the future of Gaza, regional security, and the ongoing negotiations over the Iranian nuclear deal. Several international airlines have resumed flights to and from Israel following cancellations after a Houthi missile struck near Ben Gurion Airport on May the 4th. Other carriers have extended their temporary suspension of services. With 58 hostages still held by Hamas in Gaza, renewed negotiations are underway in Doha with US involvement. Reports suggest a sense of optimism, indicating that the talks are based on the Witkoff deal framework, though with several modifications. And as we mentioned, Yuval Raphael, a survivor of October 7th, and Israel's representative at the 2025 Eurovision Song Contest, secured second place following a breathtaking performance. She was the public's favorite, receiving the highest number of votes, an extraordinary achievement, and we couldn't be prouder. And with news of an emerging ceasefire hostage deal Be sure to follow Stand With Us social media for all of the latest updates. Well, joining us now is defense expert and retired British Army officer who has appeared non-stop in international media since October the 7th, 2023. No better person to join us at this time than Colonel Richard Kemp. Richard, thank you very much for joining us again on Stand With Us TV. Colonel Kemp, welcome back to Stand With Us TV. Great to have you with us.
Great pleasure to join you, Michael.
And of course, you've spent significant time here in Israel since October the 7th, 2023. Tell us your experience on these various trips. What's it been like at the beginning of the war and since?
Yeah, I've been in Israel. I arrived on the 9th of October, and I've been here for a lot of my time since then. And I would say that when I arrived, the country was understandably in a state of deep, deep shock at the events of the 7th of October, and any country would be in that situation, I think. Of course, it was a huge failure on the part of the Israeli state that what happened on the 7th of October. We should also remember the immense heroism that occurred, and I met many people who went down just of their own volition, went down there to defend their fellow Israelis during the attacks taking place, and that's something we should not forget. But since then, and very quickly from then on, the country, I believe, became completely united in its desires to defend the citizens of Israel and the people of Israel from the terrorists. And yes, of course, in every country there is division, but I think that's, although it may be played up more in the media, I think the reality is a country that's very strong and very united. And one thing I would say about Israeli soldiers is how dedicated. I met many of them in Gaza, I met many of them outside Gaza and other different fronts, and how dedicated they are to fight for their family, their friends, their country, despite the immense danger that they face every time they set foot in the Gaza Strip. So I think it's my experience has been both of the immediate aftermath and shock, and the extraordinary resilience and courage and unity of the country.
And at no small cost as well. I know you've spent time with wounded warriors and you've witnessed them firsthand. This is a story that doesn't get told much around the world.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say, I've visited many wounded Israeli soldiers in hospitals, and one thing I would say is that despite how badly wounded they are, they almost all of them want to get back into the fight. I met a young man who'd been hit 3 times, once in the leg by an RPG missile. Fortunately, it didn't do much damage. He was shot in the same leg and shot in the head. Fortunately, the bullet didn't penetrate the helmet. All he wants to do, he was 18 years old, all he wants to do is get back into Gaza. And I think that doesn't show any kind of gung-ho spirit. It shows their fighting spirit, and it shows their determination to defend the country.
Absolutely. And you've repeatedly defended the IDF's conduct in conflicts like Gaza and prior. So what specific protocols, practices do you believe sets the IDF apart from other militaries in urban warfare?
Oh, their fighting effectiveness, I think, is extremely important, and their ability to adapt very quickly. I mean, you can train, and the IDF has trained over many years for this type of conflict, but then it's going to surprise you no matter what. No matter what you prepare for, the situation is going to be somewhat different. And I think the IDF, I've seen many examples of the IDF adapting very quickly, more I think than many other militaries, to a changed situation. And one example of that, I think, is the way that they have developed their intelligence collection system and the intelligence assessment, so that very quickly, it involves a lot of people, but very quickly actionable intelligence be taken from the battlefield, assessed, returned, so that military action can take place against terrorists. That's a very impressive thing. There's numerous other examples, the way the IDF have fought concurrently above ground, on the ground and underground in an extremely coordinated fashion. And the way they've adapted to the techniques that Hamas use of basically even terrorists above ground will not be carrying weapons, because in every house, every other house, every third house, there are weapons stashes. I've been in Gaza, I've seen boxes of grenades under children's bed, machine guns in the kitchen cupboard, all of these things. So they can travel around in civilian clothes without any indication that they're involved in terrorist activity. That makes it incredibly tough for them. But so apart from and I could give you numerous other examples of their fighting capability, but apart from that, two things I would say stand out. One is the the determination of the IDF to minimize civilian casualties inside the Gaza Strip in a very densely populated area. And they get accused of unlawful killings. They get accused of random attacks on civilian population. None of it's true. The reality is they go to extreme measures, sometimes putting Israeli soldiers' own lives in danger in order to minimize the deaths of innocent civilians. And the second thing I would say is the accusations of starvation. I don't know any other army that has done so much to try and facilitate the entry of humanitarian aid into enemy territory at the same time that it's fighting on that territory. I don't think it's ever happened before like that. So, everything you hear, or certainly most things you hear about the IDF and the way they operate are lies.
And of course, one of the raps on the IDF is this claim of proportionality that gets banded about across international media. Tell us what you see as the epitome of proportionality. How has the IDF been proportional in its conflict against Hamas?
I believe they have, yes. And proportionality is something that's very often misunderstood. What it effectively means in battle, it has a specific legal meaning in the laws of war. And what it means is that if I as a military commander want to carry out an attack, and there is a possibility that civilians might be killed or wounded in that attack, then I have to make a proportionality calculation. Is the object of my attack of sufficiently high value that it warrants killing civilians? And you can look at how many civilians might die. You can work that out, roughly speaking. It's not a science. And if that's the case, if I say that the target is sufficiently high value to warrant killing some civilians, then if I attack that target and civilians die, it is not a war crime, which many people think it is. If, on the other hand, I think, well, the target's not so important and a lot of civilians might die, I'll decide not to do so. I wouldn't carry out the attack because it would be probably disproportionate. The number of civilian deaths would be disproportionate to the military objectives. I've had to make these calculations myself many times in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, Northern Ireland. And sometimes it's a split-second decision. Sometimes it's a much longer considered decision. But as long as you go through the process and you believe that you're acting proportionally, then you're certainly not breaking any laws. And in my experience and my observations with the IDF, they invariably act proportionally.
There's a lot of talk about Israel facing war on 7 fronts, but of course there's an 8th front as well, and that's the media. And Hamas has proved itself quite adept at using the media as part of its warfare. And then on the other side, you have social media figures on mainstream media programs giving their often uninformed view. As a military expert, what gets missed in that information war?
One thing we shouldn't forget is that it's not just media, it's not just information. The 7th, or the 8th front rather, is what I would term political warfare. It goes well beyond just media and just propaganda. It includes subversion of officials in governments and in some cases buying them off. It includes deliberate efforts to brainwash or to seriously influence students on university campuses, UN bodies, and all this. It's a very sophisticated political warfare campaign that has many different elements to it, and it's very, very successful. And that's that's why we see it. By the way, this campaign is not new. It started in the 60s, and it began in the Soviet Union, who wanted to use Israel as a weapon against the US and the UK. And all the chants you hear today on university campuses, from the river to the sea, genocide, apartheid, all this began in the 60s. Same words back in the 60s, orchestrated by the Soviet Union. So students on university campuses today who are chanting from the river to the sea and apartheid and illegal occupation, illegal settlement, these people are just kind of mouthing Soviet communist words.
And you hear some personalities espousing what Israel should and shouldn't be doing, okay? And part of that involves Iran. So let's talk for a moment, if we can, about Iran. Is it possible to make a deal with the Islamic Republic?
Not in my view. You can make a deal with them, but the prospects of that deal actually meaning anything or being adhered to by Iran is pretty much zero. They can sign something, they can agree to something. You shouldn't take that as being, something that they'll stick to. So I don't think realistically it's possible. I can understand why President Trump is going through the kind of diplomatic process, trying to achieve the elimination of Iran's nuclear capability without war, without kinetic attack. But I think it's optimistic to expect that to happen. And I believe that ultimately the only way, and I don't say this lightly, and I don't, as a soldier, I've seen a lot of war, and I don't like war, and I think war is a terrible thing, as most people know. But I think the only way that we can be confident that we can eliminate the Iranian nuclear program is by military force. I don't think there is any other alternative. And I really hope, for the sake of the world, because it's not just Israel, it's not just Arab countries, it's the whole world that will be threatened by a nuclear-armed Iran, and I believe that it needs to be stopped.
What threat do the Houthis represent, not just to Israel, but to the region and indeed the world?
Well, the Houthis have done immense damage to international trade, going through the Red Sea and going through the Suez Canal. They've targeted a number of different international shipping lines for attack. So their action is not just directed against Israel. It's also directed against the West, and they talk all the time about how they haven't. I think recently one of the Houthi leaders said we have no red lines against Britain, the US, and Israel. So it's a much wider target than just Israel. And of course, we shouldn't forget the Houthis are a proxy of Iran. They're funded by Iran, they're armed by Iran, they're encouraged by Iran, they're directed by Iran to some extent. So in some ways, I see the Houthis as being a kind of maybe a smaller version, but a kind of equivalent of Hezbollah. In other words, trying to deter the West from attacking Iran. So I think President Trump is quite right to intensify the campaign against the Houthis in Yemen, with some, admittedly a small amount, but some British support. There was a British airstrike recently with the Americans against the Houthis. So they've got to be suppressed. But I think the ultimate way of dealing with the Houthis is probably to cut off their supplies from Iran, and that really necessitates again hitting Iran.
Let's look at Israel's northern border. With Hezbollah significantly degraded, what kind of a threat does that represent? And is there a moment when everything changed? Was it that famous beeper and pager attack?
I think Hezbollah used to be the strongest terrorist organization that the world has ever seen. It isn't anymore. It's now a shadow of its former self. I'm not saying it's eliminated. It still exists, and it will still try to rebuild itself. But yes, you're right. It was the grim beeper, as people call it, attack against the leadership of Hezbollah, which was a phenomenal. I don't think there's ever been an operation like that. Clinical, effective, and the work of genius, in my view. So that and that will be
and targeted. We spoke about proportionality. A targeted attack specifically at the terrorists.
Yeah, and with efforts made to minimize collateral damage while attacking the terrorists. So you're absolutely right. And then the death of Hassan Nasrallah was another turning point, follow on fairly closely. And I think that the two things combined, as well as the incessant Israeli airstrikes and ground operations against Hezbollah in Lebanon, those two things combined not only did significant material damage to Hezbollah, but also demoralize them. And they've been reeling ever since. We heard from Nasrallah's son about the effect that the beeper things had on him. He was kind of a lost man, and he was everything to Hezbollah, as well as very important figure in Iran. But then, of course, you've got on top of that, you've got the fall of the Assad regime, and that was down to Israeli action. It was down to Israeli action against Hezbollah, which meant Hezbollah couldn't protect Assad. It also was down to actions against Hamas. The way that Israel's dealt with Hamas has been severely weakened the whole of the Iranian network in the Middle East. And on top of all that, once Assad was downed, you then mean basically that Iran has lost Syria. And that was a key area, both for direct attack against Israel, but also, more importantly, probably, for supply of Hezbollah. So they're going to find it very difficult to rebuild themselves. Doesn't mean Syria is now a safe place, because now it's run by Al-Qaeda, effectively.
Right.
So Israel, with that extraordinary attack on the Syrian military capabilities, seriously weakened the jihadists that are now running Syria. But it will need to, I think Israel will need to, as it is now, keep a very close watch, and maybe, as it is now, military presence in Syria. Not to forget, of course, the people behind the jihadists in Syria, Turkey.
And on the flip side, you have the Abraham Accords. What's your take on how the Abraham Accords and those Gulf countries that made peace with Israel, how's that held up during this time of conflict?
I think it's held up extraordinarily well. And I've had many discussions with Arab leaders in this region since the war began. And my assessment of the level of support for Israel, not just from Abraham Accords countries, but from other countries, other Arab countries as well, is that the support is very strong. That maybe they'll say something different publicly, and they do often condemn Israel publicly. Under the radar, it's a very different story, and it involves not just kind of moral support for Israel privately, but also, in some cases, some very, very important practical support for Israel. Let's not forget, on the 14th of April, the Jordanian Air Force took part in the defense against the Iranian missile strikes, drone strikes against Israel, as did Saudi Arabia. So I think, the level of support by Arab countries for Israel is probably unprecedented, and is, in my view, is likely to lead to the expansion of the Abraham Accords. I think Saudi Arabia will probably come on board, hopefully in the near future. That will be transformative for the not just the support in the Middle East, but around the world, support for Israel.
Absolutely. Let me ask you a personal question, if I may. You have been a steadfast friend of Israel. You've spoken up for Israel and in defense of Israel and its military in multiple international arenas. What motivates you to do that?
When I was a child, I was taught by my parents to know right from wrong. And I was also taught that if I had any capability of trying to deal with something that was wrong, I had a duty to do so. And being not Jewish, not Israeli, with significant military experience of this type of conflict, I have been in a position to speak with at least some expertise on this conflict. And so I think that's to accept me trying to discharge my duty to try and play a part in putting right what's wrong. Secondly, this fight is not just Israel's fight. Israel's at the spearhead of an onslaught against Western civilization by jihadism all around the world. And we saw only recently arrests in London of a number of Iranian men who were planning a terrorist attack in the UK. Not the first, by the way, that Iran's done it. And that's just one part of it. But we're all under threat from jihadism, whether it be Sunni or Shia, from around the world. And we're in the same fight. And everybody, every government, every civilized government in the world should do what it can to support Israel. And I certainly try and do that from that perspective as well. And thirdly, Israel has been incredibly supportive of Britain. British owe Israel a great deal. Israeli intelligence has saved many, many British lives, military lives, civilian lives, as well as other countries, citizens of other countries' lives. And not only that, but I've got personal direct experience of being assisted by Israelis in trying to formulate my own tactics against jihadism in Afghanistan, in Iraq, etc. And then there are numerous other things on the military front, but including battlefield medical technology. Many British lives have been saved by Israeli battlefield medical technology, including some of the most, or probably the most powerful blood anti-bleeding agents. I forget what you call it, blood
tourniquet,
right? And also, and associated technology. So we owe Israel a lot, and they were, no matter what Britain does, and we've got a horrific, what I consider a totally wrong, partial arms embargo against Israel now. And our Foreign Secretary has recently been talking about recognizing something that he calls the state of Palestine. those are very bad moves. But no matter what Britain does, I think we can always count on Israel being with us, and we should, as a British person, I would strongly urge the British government to stand with us, to stand with Israel in this fight.
Well said. Finally, before we finish, you've spoken to so many Stand With Us audiences around the world, and particularly to young people, brave students standing up on campus, Jewish and not Jewish, proudly supporting Israel, proud of who they are. What's your final message to the Stand With Us audience, and particularly those young people, if I can invite you to turn to the camera and give your message to them?
Well, first thing I'd say is that Stand With Us is a phenomenal organization which does so much good to support Israel and the Jewish people around the world. Because, of course, it's not just Israel under attack, it's also Jews in the diaspora that are under attack. And I think Stand With Us provides a phenomenal resource and phenomenal action against this war. So that, that those people who want to fight, those students on the university campus or whatever, and in high schools, who want to fight for their own communities and for the state of Israel, they certainly should work with Stand With Us to achieve that. I believe that it's not a burden to support Israel. Yes, those of you who are at universities or at high schools, you've got your studies to carry out. You've got many other things, whether it be socializing, whatever. And it is extra work to become a pro-Israel and counter anti-Semitism activist. But it's not a burden. It should be seen, I think we should, all of us, see it as an honor to stand up and support Israel at this time and into the future. And I would finally say that I'm extremely optimistic about the future of Israel. It's easy to be downcast about what's been going on. It's been a very long war. It's very wearing on the Israeli people and on Jews around the world. But Israel's going to emerge from this conflict far stronger than it went into it. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, generations of Israelis, old and young, have fought, sacrificed in various different ways in this conflict. That, historically, history shows us that brings unity to any country. And secondly, I think Israel now knows who its friends and enemies are. Israel will become more self-sufficient, particularly in military capabilities, than it's been up to now. That will strengthen it. And finally, I think we spoke about it earlier, the Abraham Accords and the support of the Arab world for Israel, I think, will be a game changer, even more than it has been so far. So the prospect, in my view, is bright. All of us should do whatever we can. There's a biblical term by, I think, Prophet Isaiah. I'm not Jewish. I'm not a rabbi, but I can quote the Bible. Prophet Isaiah, when he was asked to go and help Israel by God, he said, "Here I am. Send me." And I think that's a message that we could all absorb.
Incredible message. One of my favorite Roman Catholics quoting the Bible for us here in Jerusalem. Thank you, Colonel Kemp, for your insight, for your moral leadership in a crazy world, and of course for your service. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's been another tumultuous week in Israel and the region. To break it all down, we're joined by leading defense expert and former editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. Since October the 7th, 2023, he's been a frequent and trusted voice across international media, providing critical analysis and insights. He's also the author of 3 books, including Israel versus Iran, The Shadow War. There's no better person to speak to and help us understand these latest developments than Yaakov Katz. Yaakov, thank you for being with us.
Great to be with you, Michael.
Thank you, and so much to talk about. Qatar seemed to be at the center of everything this week. Break it down for us. Why is Qatar so important? It has over 300,000 citizens, but not many more, but such an outsized influence.
Well, because you're looking at population, but look at how deep their pockets are, right? This is about how much money they have. And the Qataris have, for a long time, been very sophisticated and savvy in the way they wield that influence through the money all over the world, whether it's influence on college campuses, sports teams, businesses, real estate, New York, London, Paris, you name it. But they've also made themselves very indispensable because they're one of maybe the few, if not the only country that can talk with all sides. So they can host talks for the Americans with the Taliban, and they can host talks for the Americans or for the Israelis with the Hamas leaders. So they say they're doing this as a service to the Western world. They're able to maintain these relations that then benefit countries that need to engage with terrorist groups that otherwise they wouldn't be able to engage with on a direct level. But at the same time, there's also the more negative side of these relations. The fact that Ismail Haniyeh, who the late Hamas leader, but as well as other Hamas leaders, Khalid Mashal, who are still living in Doha, in Qatar, the fact that the Qataris have funded Hamas upwards of billions of dollars over the last few years, and the Qataris would say, well, 1 second, Israel wanted us to give money. So it's a complicated relationship, and for the Americans, though, primarily, it's a relationship of strategic importance. And this is, I think, why the Qataris can get away with it. There's a couple of reasons why the Americans view them this way. One is, again, the money and the economic benefit. We saw Trump go there, sign upwards of $1 trillion in different economic deals. This is exactly what Trump wants, the $400 million 747 Boeing, new Air Force One jet. But it's also the fact that they are home to a very important air base for the Americans of CENTCOM, the Central Command in the Middle East. This is where America can use this base to project its power all throughout the region. And altogether, this makes the Americans, we heard this under Joe Biden, we see this now under Trump, Qatar for America is one of the most strategic non-NATO allies today.
And of course, it was in Qatar, while President Trump was in Qatar, that we heard that Idan Alexander was going to be released. What role did American diplomacy play there, and how does that affect the Israeli efforts to get the hostages out?
Well, Idan Alexander is interesting because I think everyone, every Israeli definitely, and every Jew and everyone who supports the Israeli state around the world is definitely moved by the fact that this IDF soldier who had been stationed along the border from the Golani Brigade on October 7th and was taken by Hamas has been released. By the way, there were fears in the weeks leading up to his release that he might have been killed. And for a number of days, neither the Israelis nor the Americans were able to ascertain exactly what was the status of Idan Alexander. So when he resurfaced, so-called, there was a great sigh of relief. The Americans have been talking directly with Hamas. We know that. We know that Adam Bowler, who's a senior advisor to the president and is responsible for something called the hostage envoy or hostage affairs, has been talking with Hamas. This isn't the first time. We know that Steve Witkoff, the Middle East special envoy, he might not be talking directly with the Hamas leaders, but he's very close with the Qataris. And Bowler, who works in conjunction with him, is talking directly with Hamas. Hamas's interest here, I think, in releasing Idan Alexander is very much seen as a gesture to Donald Trump on the eve of his visit here to the region. They want to get the Americans on their side because they want the Americans to put pressure on the Israelis to end this war. And they understand that Israel's vulnerability is really Washington. If Donald Trump slams his fist, pounds his fist on the table and says, it's time to end this war, it's going to be hard for Israel to keep going. And I think that Hamas did this in a way to push Israel into a corner to be able to get maybe a bigger deal with a bigger ceasefire that would at least end the offensive that we might now be on the brink of in the Gaza Strip.
And of course, another thing we saw with President Trump's visit to the region was the lifting of sanctions on Syria and a meeting with al-Jilani. What does that represent for Israel?
That was a huge, I think, historic moment. I mean, beyond the humor in it all, because Donald Trump, as always, with his unpredictability in the way he speaks, later said that al-Jilani, or Ahmed al-Shara, as he's now known, is an attractive man, right, and tough looking. But if I put that aside, the fact that America's president is meeting with a man who literally yesterday was an al-Qaeda operative, a jihadist. So now he wears a suit and not army fatigues. But this guy fought against American soldiers, American forces in Iraq not that long ago. HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Shams, the radical Islamic organization, the rebel group that he led from Idlib in northwestern Syria, and which was supported by the Turks, and then barreled through Syria in just a matter of days a few months ago, was really an anti-Western al-Qaeda offshoot, right? These are not friends of the United States. They're definitely not friends of the State of Israel. But there's also an opportunity. And I think this is what we have to focus on for the moment. There's a threat, and we have to be very cautious, but there's an opportunity because Syria now is changing. And this is, by the way, to the credit of the State of Israel. I think this is what some people might be missing. Had Israel not weakened Hezbollah as it did in the war against Hezbollah in Lebanon, had had not weakened Iran like it did after the April of last year and October of last year missile attacks against Israel. Israel bombed and destroyed their surface-to-air missile defense systems, the S-300s. We have changed the region as a country. Our military has changed the region. This is what allowed Ashara to be able to barrel through and take over Syria. What pained me was that while the president of the United States is meeting with Ashara, this is to Israel's credit. Israel should be getting the credit, right? Now, can this lead to a normalization process with Israel? Very possibly. But Israel has been burned too many times, and I think that that's what we also have to keep in mind. We pulled out of Gaza in 2005. Look at what happened. We pulled out of Lebanon in 2000. Look at what happened. We've pulled out of areas in the West Bank, and we look at what happened. So Israelis, when you say to them, you know, there's a now jihadist who became put on a suit, and now he talks like a Westerner, and everything's going to be okay, why would we believe that this time it will be different? So we have to be cautious, but I think we also have to give potential normalization or steps in that direction a chance.
And the regime, obviously, in Iran giving a watchful eye to all of this taking shape. What does the potential Iranian nuclear deal look like? What do those discussions look like right now, and how should we view this?
That's very concerning. I think when I look at the region and I see everything else that's happening, you know, Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah now beaten back, but still there, still with capabilities, and they're going to wait for the day that they can maybe strike once again. Al-Jilani or Ashara and what's happening in Syria, will they be good? Will they be bad? You know, we have to be wary and cautious and prepared on all of these different fronts. And tragically, we see still in the West Bank terrorism that strikes, and the mother who was on her way to deliver her fourth child in the hospital, shot and killed. I mean, these are horrific attacks that still take place just in our midst. But when we look at Iran, this is the potential for an existential threat for the state of Israel. And this is why it's a whole other league. It's a whole other level of what we potentially face. It does seem that the Americans right now are determined beyond any doubt to reach a deal with Iran. And in this determination, which is maybe motivated by the fact that the president wants to avoid a war, I think it's also motivated by this interest by President Trump, to make a deal, which is always the most important objective. Make a deal with Iran, make a deal with Hamas, make a deal with the Qataris, whether it's an economic deal, a business deal, a military deal, or a nuclear deal. He wants deals. And the Iranian deal that seems to be coming together, though, is not very different than the JCPOA, the 2015 nuclear accord that Barack Obama reached back then, which Israel was extremely opposed to and vehemently opposed to back in the day. This deal,
and Donald Trump was opposed to.
And Donald Trump pulled out of, correct, thank you, in 2018, right? Only now to go back into it. So what exactly will be the framework of this seems to be something that we should be concerned about, because what's coming out, for example, we don't know for certain yet, but there have been reports that the Americans have said to them, listen, you have to stop advanced enrichment of uranium. So, you know, you can do to 3.4%, which would be for so-called civilian program, which they don't really have and don't really need. But anything above that, 20% or even 60%, which they've reached, 90% is military. You don't need 20% for civilian nuclear programs, right? You don't. That's only on your path to a military program. That would stop. They would offshore it, send it out, and they would get, for the at least first few years, enriched uranium at the 3.4% level from the Russians. But then after a couple of years, they would be able to restart their enrichment. So they're holding on to all the centrifuges. This is Israel's greatest concern. Why do they need the centrifuges? And here we're going to have an issue. Now, the bigger problem, to some extent, is we all remember, Michael, how in 2015, Netanyahu was able to go to Washington and fight tooth and nail against this deal. And that's what got Donald Trump eventually, a couple of years later, to pull out of it. Can he fight Donald Trump the same way he was able to fight Barack Obama? I don't think so. So this puts Israel in a bit of a bind and in a very delicate situation right now, where I think we have to skillfully and carefully work to influence the administration to make sure that the deal that is reached, which would avoid a war, which is always good, but it's not a deal that's just going to kick the can down the road by another 5, 10, 15 years.
And of course, another deal made by President Trump was with the Houthis, surprisingly agreeing not to bombard international shipping, U.S. ships. But Israel left out in the cold in that deal. What's the story?
Again, this is part of this concerning new wave that we have here among Israeli officials who I talk to, and they're watching what's happening with the administration. So there's the Iran, and there's the Don Alexander going and bypassing Israel and making a deal to get this one American Israeli hostage released. But also with the Houthis, right? He announces out of the blue that he's made a deal with the Houthis that they're going to stop attacking boats that are sailing through the Red Sea. So basically reopen the line of shipping, and America will stop its attacks against Yemen. But no mention of Israel. In other words, Israel, which is still attacked, and we had just a air siren in the middle of the night. I'm sure you in your home had to wake up.
Certainly did.
But we've been having them every few days now. This is something that just really raises the question: if you're making a deal with the Houthis, why are you leaving Israel on the sidelines? And I don't know that there's a really good answer, but the answer that I could potentially give is we have to recognize that relations with the Americans, it's not a zero-sum game, right? It's not that the Americans are totally with us or totally against us. There are American interests that are not always going to be our interests. And right now, for Donald Trump, making that deal with the Houthis is a greater interest. And if Israel still will get hammered once in a while with a missile here or there, most of which are intercepted by our missile defense systems like the Arrow, then so be it.
And the idea of targeting this week Mohammed Sinwar, the brother of
Yahya
Sinwar, taken out already by the IDF. What does that represent? What does he represent to Hamas? It's not just a tit-for-tat family affair.
These two brothers were really the leaders of Hamas over the last few years. Yahya was more front-facing, and he was a former prisoner in Israeli jails. He was released back in the Gilad Shalit deal in 2011, rose to power and fame, and probably one of the most ruthless, sadistic, and bloodthirsty Hamas leaders. None of them are good. None of them are Zionists, but this guy was a whole other level and was the mastermind behind the October 7th massacre and assault on Israel. His brother Muhammad, less known, had his strategic responsibilities. One of them, for example, the tunnel infrastructure throughout Gaza. He was one of the guys who was the mastermind, by the way, of the kidnapping of Gilad Shalit in 2006, which he then held on to for a number of years and made sure that his brother would be released in that swap 5 years later. Muhammad took up the reins of the leadership of Hamas after his brother Yahya was killed by Israeli soldiers just about a year ago or so. And since then, he has really dug in his heels when it came to the possibility of a hostage deal between Israel and Hamas. There's a lot of misinformation out there. And there's a lot of criticism that is legitimate also about the government here in Israel and if they have not been stalling. But no one can argue with the fact that we are up against a bloodthirsty, murderous terrorist organization, Hamas, led by Mohammed Sinwar. If he's now dead, and it does seem that that's the case after the bombing of the tunnel complex near a hospital in Khan Yunis, the prospect that new leadership will take over, and we have to wait and see what exactly that leadership will look like, might be more flexible and open to a deal with Israel that could see some of the hostages released. Too early to say that. It's premature, but that is, I think, the hope right now within the defense establishment of Israel. And for that reason, I think we're not yet seeing that full onslaught and assault that Israel had been threatening and saber-rattling, that we're going to go in and take over all of Gaza once again. The chariots, the Gideon, the name of this operation that they had given it, that's still moving slower than some people expected, because people thought it was going to start right away after Trump's visit. Trump's visit is now over for a couple of days. It seems that Israel is giving a chance to see what's going to be the effect, the ripple effect of Mohammed Sinwar's elimination.
Very fluid situation. I know you've studied extensively October 7th, 2023, and you have a new book coming out later this year called While Israel Slept. What do we expect to learn from that book?
I mean, the book is, I can't say it's the most positive, experience when you read it, because it's a very deeply disturbing story. And definitely the first part of the book, where we really go into detail of what happened in the 48 hours leading up to October 7th, the different signs that were there, the alarms that were blaring literally in different offices, and the pieces that were all, if they had been put together, small decisions could have prevented, and the whole world would be different. And that's what you just want to bang your head against the wall when you read this, because you say to yourself, if only they had. And unfortunately, they didn't. And we find ourselves where we are. But then it goes back in time, and it looks at from the rise of Hamas back in the late 80s to what Hamas became on the eve of October 7th. How come Israel never decided to take on Hamas in a real way? We fought these rounds of violence. We had cycles and every 2-3 years or so. But we had a genocidal, terrorist, murderous group on our border. And we somehow, the state of Israel, the Jewish people in Israel, said to ourselves, no, it's okay. We can live like this. We can arrange for Qatari money to go there. We can arrange for some workers to come in. We can fight and hit them a little. They'll hit us a little. And we'll kick the can down the road. And really, what I think has me most concerned is how do we prevent this from happening again? Because I think you and I both know, Michael, that this could happen again. For one very simple reason. The Israeli people want peace at our core. We don't want to fight. So if we see an opportunity to stave off a conflict, not to have to fight, we will probably prefer that, even if it means we're kicking the can down the road. And for that reason, I think we really have to look at this region in a whole different lens today. How do we ensure that war will not happen again? Is unfortunately the only way to do that right now is to fight this war now. And that's painful and that's depressing. But it also gives me some optimism and hope, because I see what's happening right now. I see the change in the region, and I see that there are such amazing opportunities. We spoke about them: Syria, Iran's vulnerability, what's happening with Hezbollah, which has been degraded. The region has changed. Can we take advantage of what's changed now in this region to bring in a new era, which will prevent that war that might otherwise come in the future?
Important lessons we need to learn. While Israel Slept is available for pre-order right now. Yaakov Katz, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your analysis.
Thank you.
And finally, the Stand With Us Solidarity Mission is currently touring Israel, holding high-level meetings, organizing a huge concert and meals for IDF soldiers, volunteering, and much more. We were together standing in Hostage Square as Eden Alexander was released. Take a look.
Just made 300 sandwiches and lunches in 1 hour. That is something to be really grateful for. I want to thank you all.
באתי לעולם לתת את הזמן. הלאה, כל מי שקיוויתי שיהיה פה כאן. כולכם, נעים מאוד, אני מוכן.
That's our show for today. Don't forget, if you enjoy our live shows and want to be kept up to speed with all that's going on, you can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or click on the subscribe button on YouTube. And before we go, if you'd like to help our efforts, you can do something great today. Go to StandWithUs.com/donate to support our work. Thank you. We're sending love to the Israeli troops and to our brothers and sisters and allies worldwide, and our prayers for every hostage to be back home with their family soon. Together we will prevail. Thanks for watching. Am Yisrael Chai.